there are still thousands missing. Nobody's sure what happened to them. These are people who disappeared years ago, whether it was during the uprising and the start of the civil war in 2011, or dating back to decades, really, of the Assad family's repression.
How much will what's happened in Syria shape the Middle East and also the West's influence? Firstly, Putin. Is he playing a losing game? Within hours of Syrian rebels entering Damascus, Russian state television attempted to downplay the ignorance for Moscow and the collapse of President Assad's regime, the Kremlin's biggest ally in the Middle East. And what about the US? In the very immediate term, they're trying to secure or destroy Syria's chemical and biological weapons, fearful that the sudden toppling of the Assad regime may mean stockpiles ends up in the hands of groups like Islamic State or other extremists. But what about the longer term too? Jim Townsend is the former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under Obama and Biden and joins us now. Jim, thank you very much for staying up to speak to us. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How about you?
Very well. Just explain to us, who has the most chance right now to influence what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, we're all looking to see the answer to that question. We know who doesn't have influence anymore. Looks like Tehran has had a very bad week and a very bad year. The Russians are trying to decide whether they're going to retreat out of Syria. They're trying to figure out what the future is going to be for their presence there. The U.S. is standing back a bit, asking that all minorities are taken care of. I think really in terms of influence, it's that young 30-year-old guerrilla leader who swept into Damascus. I think he's holding all the cards, I think the Turks are going to play a big role in this too. But they're trying to figure it out as well. Their big concern is the Kurds, they also, I'm sure, are going to want to be influential in Damascus. So I think the Kurds are going to be probably in the lead right now in terms of trying to exert influence and control things there.
How challenging is it to engineer regime change to avoid, as we've seen in the past several different times in the Middle East, what happens when a regime is toppled is then you get chaos?
You're absolutely right. And I keep thinking about Kabul. Remember when Afghanistan fell and Kabul was evacuated? It happened so fast. And in a sense, it's got the same feel here. You now have a bit of they're not necessarily ragtag, but close to it in terms of being a group of fighters who've now taken Damascus, and they're having to convert themselves into civil servants. And I understand they're trying to get the police and a lot of the government officials, at least the civil servants, to stay in the government. So I think they probably realize, like we do, that it's going to be very hard to keep chaos from breaking out all over. And so I think they're going to do what they can. They seem to have discipline. They were able to stop some of the robbery and that type of thing that was going on as some of these towns fell. So, we'll just have to see. But, our experience with the Taliban was, as they were saying these nice things at the very, very beginning, how they were going to let women have freedoms and do all these things. And of course, they've turned barbaric once again. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see.
In a moment or two, we're going to speak to the Times Middle East correspondent about exactly sort of the logistics of what's happening and the efforts in place to try and mitigate and reduce chaos as much as possible. It was interesting, Jim, that you said earlier, the US are kind of sort of stepping back and taking stock. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a feeling that we can make it worse if we jump in with both feet, and that's something that I think particularly this administration doesn't want to see. I mean, Biden went through Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, this isn't something that they're a bit gun shy, if you will. So I think they're looking back, they're standing back. We don't have a lot of influence there either, quite frankly. We don't even have an embassy there in Damascus. We have to work through the Turks. So we don't have a lot that we could do there anyway. And so I think a lot of what Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, is doing is trying to get the word through the Turks to the various groups to please, take into consideration minority rights and all these nice things. But as you point out, it's going to be pretty chaotic. So really, for the U.S., there's not a whole lot we can do. And if we do try, I'm not so sure it wouldn't make things worse.
And in the very short term, what they're trying to do is seize, secure or destroy any chemical weapons they believe might be in Syria.
That's right. The Israelis are doing that too. I think the Israelis have conducted a lot of strikes.
They have, yeah.
And I think that's something that there's very wise to do. That would be even worse than chaos, is chaos plus chemical weapons.
Jim, are you optimistic for what happens next?
Well, I guess I start off by saying anything is better than Assad, and the horrors that we're seeing in his prisons and the horrors we know that he has put on his people through, chemical attack and that kind of thing. As far as the future, we've seen since the Arab Spring and a lot of the turmoil that anything can happen. And what looked great at first, liberty, freedom. Remember in Egypt, all of that celebration can quickly turn in the wrong direction. And we have to remember, too, that this guerrilla leader, this rebel leader, they were branded terrorists. And that area, that part of Syria that he commanded was seen as a place of torture and that type of thing. So we're not dealing with a Jeffersonian Democrat, as we like to say here in Washington. We're not dealing with George Washington and the Declaration of Independence here. We're dealing with a group that has knocked out a bloodthirsty Assad. The Assad family is no longer reigning, and we'll just have to see and take measure of what these disparate groups are, and keeping in mind too that it's not just one group that's come sweeping in here. This is it's a coalition of groups, and will they turn on each other? We're just going to have to see what happens. So I'm by nature optimistic, but I think in this case, I'm going to wait and see.
Jim, thank you so much. Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under Obama and Biden. Well, Jim was talking there about the prisons. The front page of the Times this morning shows a man holding up two thick ropes. They are blood-stained and they're tied into nooses. They were found at Sednaya. It's a notorious jail, nicknamed the human slaughterhouse. Thousands of critics of the Assad regime were taken there. Yesterday, thousands of people travelled to the prison, desperate to find clues about the whereabouts of the people killed, jailed, tortured by the regime. Joining us now is Samir Al-Atrush, the Times Middle East correspondent. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We are starting to see, tell us what we learnt yesterday, more about the sort of scale of the oppression of the regime.
Yeah, I think everyone knew that Assad had jailed thousands and thousands over the past decades. We've seen people being freed from jails who went in as teenagers and have emerged as elderly men. People who appear to have been born in prison, toddlers and young children. The main symbol, really, the Bastille, as it were, of Syria was Syednaya prison near Damascus. And over the past 48 hours, thousands of prisoners have been released. The dungeons, basically, in underground dungeons and cells across the complex. Now, disappointingly for many, many people, their relatives have not yet emerged. The Syrian relief services and aid workers have appealed to people to stop spreading rumors about even, more secret dungeons underground, because, people just were holding on to the hope that they hadn't reached those kind of darkest recesses of Syednaya. But it seems that, Syednaya has been completely evacuated now. There are still thousands missing. Nobody's sure what happened to them. These are people who disappeared years ago, whether it was during the uprising and the start of the civil war in 2011, or dating back to decades, really, of the Assad family's repression. In some cases, people just realized that their relatives were alive when they saw their footage or their pictures on social media as they were emerging from prisons. In other cases, they're nowhere to be found, and there's no word about their fate.
Yeah, and people obviously absolutely desperate for news. The rebels who forced Assad from power, they are said to be, the Times is reporting today, hunting down Syrian government prison administrators who might have any knowledge of the whereabouts of other prison facilities across Syria. I mean, what do you know of that?
Yeah, so they're looking. I mean, they're the main thing I think right now on many people's minds is where are the missing people? What's happened to them? There's a lot of answers that many Syrians want, and the authorities at this point, the new authorities, are appealing to people to stop going to these prisons and impeding any work that can happen there, because people are just desperate for long lost relatives. There are several Americans who the U.S. is looking for. We still haven't had any official confirmation on what's happened to them. One of them, Austin Tice, Biden said he was just this week that he's still believed to be alive, and that's just the foreigners there. But for Syrians, I mean, people have been disappearing since the 70s and 80s in Syria, and it was always a very arbitrary police state. You'd hear reports of Christians being arrested and detained on suspicion of being members of the Muslim Brotherhood, cases of mistaken identity, or blogging something, saying something critical in a cafe. Anything could have landed people in prison. So that's a priority, I think, now, to try to find out what happened to them. I think the new rebel kind of hastily assembled government is also trying to track down really anyone from Assad's regime they say had blood on their hands. So on the one hand, they're promising reconciliation with people who hadn't taken part in or directly been involved in killings or abuses. On the other hand, they are desperate to track these people down who they say were indeed involved in the repression.
This hastily assembled government, as you describe it, how is it operating? Do we know how HTS want to govern?
Well, we've had indications. I think what their main focus right now is twofold, really. First of all, to impose some sense of order, particularly in Damascus. So they have imposed a curfew, and they are calling on people not to loot government buildings or former sort of government or regime-affiliated installations. On the other hand, they've had some experience governing Idlib, and in some ways better than Assad had been governing the rest of Syria. Assad. The thing about Assad when he fell, I think it was a mistaken assumption to believe that he was really in control of anything at that point. The first people that entered Damascus and freed Damascus they came from the southern province Daraa, which had nominally been under his control. But the moment that they saw the protests up in the north and then the opposition campaign up in the north, they just reverted back to being opposition members and they stormed the capital. So the entire country really hasn't seen much order. You've had, the American-backed Kurdish militia, the SDF, in the east, and then you had the Turkish-backed militias in the north, and they're still battling it out among each other because they are opposed to each other. And then you have the HTS-led rebels who came in from Idlib, and so there's still a lot of areas of lawlessness. And it's. I think one thing that they want to try to do is they're sitting down with each other as much as possible, or talking to each other to avoid. The next stage of seeing a power struggle and a land grab. And then you also have, international powers who are getting involved as well. So the U.S. has been upping its airstrikes against ISIS in the east just to make sure that they don't try to seize the chaos and regroup and take more towns or expand their areas. Israel's conducted dozens, reportedly more than 200 airstrikes in one of their biggest campaigns, really, in recent memory, taking out military sites that belong to the Assad regime and also seizing parts of a buffer zone that they say now, well, it's been abandoned by the regime, so the agreement is null. So you have all of this going on in the country in a very, very, I mean, just the pace of events is really hard to imagine. We went from 2 weeks ago, people assuming that Assad was in control. The rebels were confined to Idlib. Assad was rehabilitating himself in the region. He was talking with the Americans and the Europeans about possible sanctions relief to what we're seeing now. The one thing that you hear a lot from people, obviously, the experience of the Arab Spring has been very, very bitter. I covered Egypt, I covered Libya, I saw how those countries fall apart, obviously, after the uprisings in 2011. Now, what Syrians are saying is that their main focus and emphasis is on not repeating that. And they say, we've been at war for 13 years. It's a war that's killed 500,000 people. So I think we'd reached a point, and what we saw over the past week is that pretty much everyone was on the same page that Assad had to go, and that they should give them, the country deserves a new chance to do something that they haven't really been able to do. They haven't been given the opportunity to do for decades, and they hope that they can pull it off. Obviously, it's a very complicated situation, lots of factions with rival interests, but the idea is that we are too tired to fight amongst ourselves anymore. So hopefully that's sort of the spirit that they take into the negotiations among themselves.
Yeah, and hopefully that sentiment prevails. Sama, thank you so much. Sama Atrush, at the Times Middle East correspondent, on, well, just some of the dynamics at play, talking about, just how much has changed in the last fortnight. Thank you so much.